The 7 stages of demand-led selling, a framework for consultative sales that actually closes. Most people who fail at selling don't fail because they lack charisma. They don't fail because the product is bad. They fail because they never learned that a sale is not a moment, it's a structure. And when you don't have a structure, every conversation is improvisation. And improvisation in complex sales is just a polite word for gambling. Here's what almost every sales training gets wrong. They teach you how to handle objections. They teach you closing techniques. They teach you how to create urgency. And all of those things assume you've already done the real work, which is understanding what the other person actually needs, not what you want to sell them. That's the difference between pushing a product and leading with demand. And that difference is not a style preference. It's the difference between building a career and burning through contacts. Today I want to walk you through 7 stages of a demand-led selling process. Not a script, not a trick sheet, but a structural framework drawn from consultative selling methodology, from behavioral psychology, and from the hard lessons of real enterprise sales. This framework is influenced by the kind of thinking you find in books like The Challenger Sale, the sales philosophy embedded in how companies like MetLife train their top advisors, and the broader wisdom of thinkers like Charlie Munger and Naval Ravikant, who understood that all high-value exchange, whether in business, investing, or relationships, runs on trust, judgment, and structure. Let's get into it. Stage 1: Approach with intent, not with hunger. The first stage is the approach, and this is where most people already lose, because they approach prospects the way a hungry person approaches a buffet, grabbing everything, hoping something tastes good. They pitch too early, they talk about features, they lead with themselves, but here's what's actually happening in the brain of the person you're approaching. The moment someone senses they are being sold to, the amygdala, the threat detection center of the brain, fires. It doesn't matter how polished your pitch is. If the other person's nervous system categorizes you as a threat to their autonomy, their wallet, or their time, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational evaluation, gets suppressed. They stop listening to your logic. They start looking for the exit. This is not a metaphor. This is neuroscience. The amygdala hijack is real, and it happens in milliseconds. So your first job in any approach is not to impress. It's to disarm. You need to signal safety before you signal value. How do you do that? You lead with curiosity about them, not information about you. You ask a question that shows you've done research. You reference something specific to their world, their industry, their challenge, their recent move. You demonstrate that you are not a random seller firing into the dark. You are someone who showed up because you noticed something. Naval Ravikant has this concept of specific knowledge, the kind of knowledge that can't be trained for, that comes from your unique combination of experience, obsession, and pattern recognition. In selling, specific knowledge shows up in how you approach. A generic approach says, I have no specific knowledge about you. A tailored approach says, I've been paying attention, and I think I see something worth discussing. The approach is not where you sell. The approach is where you earn the right to have a conversation. And that right is earned through relevance, not through enthusiasm. Stage 2: Build rapport that's real, not performative. Stage 2 is rapport, and I need to be blunt here. Most of what passes for rapport building in sales is theater. Complimenting someone's office, talking about the weather, asking about their weekend. That's not rapport, that's filler. Real rapport is the moment when the other person's mirror neurons start firing in a way that says, this person understands my situation. Mirror neurons are the brain cells that activate both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing or expressing something we recognize. They are the neurological basis of empathy. And empathy is the foundation of trust. But here's the critical distinction. Empathy in selling is not about feeling what they feel. It's about demonstrating that you understand the structure of their problem. You don't need to cry with them. You need to articulate their situation in a way that makes them say, "Yes, that's exactly it." This is where most amateur sellers and most trained sellers diverge. The amateur tries to be liked. The trained seller tries to be understood as someone who understands. That's a completely different game. Charlie Munger had this principle he called inversion. Instead of asking, "How do I build rapport?" ask, "What destroys rapport?" And the answer is clear: talking too much about yourself, making assumptions without asking, and treating rapport as a checkbox rather than a genuine exchange. Avoid those three things and rapport often builds itself. In a real consultative selling process, rapport isn't a phase you complete and move past. It's an ongoing condition. If rapport breaks at any point, because you pushed too hard, assumed too much, or stopped listening, the entire structure collapses. You can't close a deal on a broken bridge. The practical move here: in your next 5 conversations, track how many minutes you spend talking versus listening. If you're above 40% talking in the first half of any meeting, you're building a stage, not building rapport. And people don't buy from stages. They buy from people who made them feel heard. Stage 3: discover the real need, not the stated one. This is where the demand-led framework diverges most sharply from traditional selling. Most sales methodologies tell you to identify needs. That sounds reasonable. But it misses something crucial. People almost never tell you their real need in the first conversation. Sometimes they don't even know it themselves. There's a concept in cognitive neuroscience about the difference between surface-level processing and deep processing. When someone tells you, "We're looking for a new software solution," that's surface. That's the symptom. The real need might be, "Our team is drowning in manual work, and we're losing our best people because they're frustrated." Or it might be, "Our CEO promised the board a 15% efficiency gain, and we have no idea how to deliver it." Those are completely different needs, and they require completely different conversations. The discovery stage is not about asking, "What do you need?" It's about asking layered questions that move from the surface to the structure. You start with situational questions: what's happening now? Then you move to problem questions, where the friction is. Then you move to implication questions: what happens if nothing changes? And finally, you arrive at value questions: what would it mean if this were solved? This is not a script. This is a thinking structure, and the reason it works is because of how the brain processes its own problems. When you ask someone an implication question, "If this continues for another year, what does that cost you?" You're activating their prefrontal cortex in a way that forces them to simulate a future consequence. That simulation creates emotional weight, and emotional weight is what moves decisions. But here's the trap. If you ask these questions mechanically, like you're running through a checklist, people feel interrogated. The art is to make these questions feel like a natural conversation, because you're genuinely curious, not because you're following a formula. This is where the difference between a salesperson and a sales professional becomes obvious. A salesperson uses questions to steer toward a pitch. A professional uses questions to understand whether there's a real fit and is willing to walk away if there isn't. Naval talks about playing long-term games with long-term people. In selling, this means that discovery is not just about this deal. It's about understanding this person's world well enough that even if this deal doesn't close, you've built enough insight and trust that the next opportunity, or the referral, is already forming. Every serious seller I've met who consistently performs at a high level treats discovery as an investment, not an extraction. Let me give you a concrete scenario. Imagine you're selling enterprise consulting services to a mid-size manufacturing company. The operations director tells you, "We need to improve our supply chain efficiency." That's the stated need. A junior seller hears that and immediately starts talking about their supply chain optimization package. A demand-led seller asks, when you say efficiency, what does that look like in practice? Where are you losing the most time? Is this a capacity issue, a coordination issue, or a visibility issue? And then listens, really listens, because the answer to that question changes everything about what you propose, how you price it, and whether you should even be in this deal at all. The discovery stage is where you earn the right to propose, and you earn it by understanding the demand, not by assuming it. Stage 4, qualify ruthlessly. Not everyone deserves a proposal. Stage 4 is qualification, and this is the stage that most people skip because it feels uncomfortable. Qualification means deciding whether this prospect is actually worth your time, your energy, and your proposal. And most sellers don't do this because they're afraid of having a smaller pipeline. They'd rather have 50 weak leads than 5 strong ones, but here's the math that most people refuse to confront. If you spend equal time on 50 prospects and only 5 of them are real, you've diluted your effort by a factor of 10. You've given each real opportunity 1/10 of the attention it deserves. And in complex sales, attention is everything. The quality of your proposal, the depth of your follow-up, the precision of your positioning, all of that depends on having enough bandwidth to go deep. And you can't go deep on 50 things. Charlie Munger's concept of the circle of competence applies here directly. Your circle of competence as a seller is not just about what you know, it's about who you can genuinely serve. If a prospect's real need falls outside your capability, or if their budget doesn't match your model, or if the decision maker isn't actually in the room, qualifying them out is not a failure. It's discipline. And discipline is what separates professionals from performers. There's a deeper psychological mechanism at work here too. The brain has a well-documented bias called the sunk cost fallacy. Once you've invested time in a prospect, you feel compelled to keep going, even when the signals say it's not going to work. This is your dopamine prediction circuit working against you. Your brain predicted a reward when you first engaged this prospect. Now, even though the evidence says the reward isn't coming, your brain doesn't want to let go of the prediction. It keeps telling you maybe the next meeting will be different. And that's how people waste months chasing dead deals. The antidote is a qualification framework, not a rigid checklist, but a set of honest questions you ask yourself after every discovery conversation. Does this prospect have a real problem that I can solve, not a vague interest, but a problem with consequences? Is the person I'm talking to someone who can actually make or influence the decision? Is there a realistic budget, or at least a willingness to invest if the case is strong enough? Is there a timeline, a reason this needs to happen now, not someday? And finally, do I actually want this client? Because not every client who can pay is a client worth having. That last question is the one nobody teaches, but it matters enormously. The Talmud has a principle about business relationships. A deal built on mutual respect and clear terms endures. A deal built on desperation or misalignment creates problems that outlast the revenue. If you take on a client who doesn't respect your expertise, who constantly renegotiates after agreeing, who treats you as a vendor rather than a partner, you haven't won a deal. You've signed up for a slow drain on your energy, your reputation, and your ability to serve better clients. Qualification is not about being arrogant, it's about being honest. And honesty, in the long run, is the most efficient complex sales strategy there is. Stage 5, present the solution as a mirror, not a monologue. Now we arrive at the presentation. And this is where everything you've built in stages 1 through 4 either pays off or falls apart. Most people treat the presentation as their moment to shine. They build elaborate slide decks. They rehearse their feature lists. They make everything about the product or the service, and they lose the room in the first 3 minutes. Because the prospect is not sitting there thinking, "Tell me about your company." The prospect is sitting there thinking, do you understand my problem and can you solve it? The demand-led presentation is structured as a mirror. You reflect back what you heard in discovery. You say, based on our conversations, here's what I understand about your situation. And then you lay it out, their problem, the implications they described, the gap between where they are and where they need to be. Only after you've demonstrated that you fully grasp their world do you introduce your solution. And even then, the solution is framed not as what we offer, but as how this addresses what you told me. This works because of a principle in cognitive science called the generation effect. When people hear their own words, their own problems, their own priorities reflected back to them, the information feels more real and more trustworthy than when they hear new information from a stranger. You're not teaching them something new. You're confirming something they already know and showing them a path through it. There's also a neural mechanism at play with what psychologists call cognitive ease. When information is presented in a way that matches what the brain already expects, it processes more fluently, feels more credible, and generates less resistance. By mirroring their language, their priorities, and their framework, you reduce cognitive load. You make it easy for them to say yes, not because you tricked them, but because you genuinely aligned your solution with their demand. Here's what this looks like in practice. Suppose you're presenting a talent development program to a VP of HR. Instead of starting with, our program has 5 modules and uses blended learning, you start with, you mentioned that your biggest challenge right now isn't hiring, it's retention. Specifically, your mid-level managers are leaving within 18 months because they don't see a growth path. And the cost of replacing each one is roughly 1.5 times their annual salary. Here's how we address that specific problem. Now you're not selling a program, you're solving their retention crisis. The product is the same. The framing is completely different, and framing in complex sales is almost everything. One more thing about the presentation stage. It's tempting to show everything you can do. Don't. Munger's principle of simplicity applies. Take a simple idea and take it seriously. Present the 2 or 3 things that directly address their stated and unstated needs. Leave the rest for later. Overloading a prospect with options is not generosity, it's confusion. And confusion kills deals. Stage 6. Handle concerns, not objections. I deliberately use the word concerns instead of objections. The word objection frames the conversation as adversarial, as if the prospect is blocking you and you need to overcome them. That framing is toxic. It puts you and the prospect on opposite sides of the table, and in consultative selling, you should always be on the same side. When a prospect raises a concern about price, timing, fit, risk, they are not attacking you. They are processing. They are doing exactly what the prefrontal cortex is designed to do. Evaluating, comparing, anticipating consequences. This is rational behavior, and it should be welcomed, not fought. The neuroscience here is straightforward. When someone expresses a concern, their brain is in evaluation mode. If you respond defensively, with a canned rebuttal, with pressure, with "let me explain why that's not an issue," you trigger the amygdala again. You shift them from evaluation to defense. And once they're in defense mode, the conversation is functionally over. They might stay polite, they might nod along, but their brain has already decided, this person is not safe. The demand-led approach to concerns has 3 steps. First, acknowledge, say it back to them in your own words. So your concern is that the implementation timeline might conflict with your Q3 launch. This shows you're listening and you're not dismissing them. Second, explore, ask what's behind the concern. What specifically about the timeline worries you? Is it resource allocation, or is it the risk of disruption? Often, the stated concern is not the real concern. The real concern is underneath, and you can only find it by asking. Third, resolve, address the real concern with evidence, with an adjusted plan, or with an honest admission. Sometimes the answer is, "You're right, our standard timeline doesn't fit your situation. Here's what we can adjust, and here's what we can't." That last part, the honest admission, is the most powerful move in complex selling. Because it does something almost no competitor will do, it tells the truth. And truth, in a world saturated with pitch decks and promises, is extraordinarily persuasive. The Talmud has a principle that's worth internalizing here. A half-truth is a whole lie. If you hide a limitation, minimize a risk, or dodge a legitimate concern, you might get through this meeting, but you've planted a seed of distrust that will grow. In complex sales, where deals take weeks or months to close and relationships last years, a single moment of dishonesty can undo everything. The prospect might not catch it today, but they'll catch it eventually. And when they do, you don't just lose one deal, you lose the entire relationship and every referral it would have generated. I want to give you a real scenario to bring this to life. Suppose you're selling an enterprise cybersecurity solution. The CTO says, "Your platform looks strong, but I'm worried about integration with our legacy systems." A bad seller says, "Oh, our platform integrates seamlessly with everything." A demand-led seller says, "That's a legitimate concern. Integration with legacy systems is actually one of the most complex parts of any cybersecurity deployment. Can you tell me specifically which systems you're most concerned about? Because some integrations we handle natively, and some require custom work, and I want to be honest with you about which is which." That response does three things. It validates the CTO's intelligence, it demonstrates expertise, and it builds trust by being transparent about limitations. That CTO is now more likely to work with you, not less, because you treated the concern as real instead of trying to make it disappear. Stage 7, close by confirming, not by pressuring. The final stage, and this is the one that gets the most mythology built around it, the close. Sales culture has turned the close into this dramatic moment, the always be closing mentality, the trial close, the assumptive close, the urgency close. And most of those techniques were designed for transactional, one-time, low-trust sales. They do not work in complex, consultative B2B environments. They backfire. Here's why. By the time you reach stage 7 in a demand-led process, the close should feel almost inevitable. If you've approached with intent, built real rapport, discovered the true need, qualified honestly, presented a mirrored solution, and handled concerns with transparency, the prospect already knows whether they want to work with you. The close is not where you convince them. The close is where you confirm what both of you already know. The neuroscience supports this. Decision-making research shows that most complex decisions are made emotionally before they are rationalized logically. The prefrontal cortex constructs the logical justification after the limbic system has already committed. By stage 7, if the emotional commitment is there, if the prospect feels understood, trusts your competence, and sees the fit, the logical confirmation is a formality. All you need to do is make it easy. That means the close is simple. You summarize what was agreed. You outline the next steps. You ask, based on everything we've discussed, does this feel like the right path forward? Not, are you ready to sign today? Not, what's it going to take to get this done? Those are pressure tactics, and pressure in complex sales is the enemy of trust. Naval has this idea that in the long run, the people who win are the ones who are authentic, patient, and consistent. The close is where all three converge. Authentic, because you're not pretending, you're confirming. Patient, because you've invested the time to understand, not rushed to pitch. Consistent, because every stage of your process has been aligned with the same principle. Understand demand first, then serve it. If the prospect says no at stage 7, after all that work, it means one of two things. Either the fit genuinely isn't there, in which case walking away is the right move and preserves the relationship for the future. Or something in stages 1 through 6 was incomplete, a need was missed, a concern wasn't fully resolved, a stakeholder wasn't included. In that case, the answer isn't more pressure. It's going back to the stage where the gap exists and doing the work. Let me give you a scenario. You've been working with a prospect for 6 weeks. A director of operations at a logistics company. You've done discovery, you've mapped their pain points, you've presented a tailored solution, you've addressed their concerns about implementation risk. Now you're in the final meeting. Instead of pulling out a contract and saying, "Let's get this locked in," you say, "We've covered a lot of ground together. You told me your biggest challenge was visibility across your distribution network, and that blind spots were costing you roughly $200,000 a year in delays and penalties. We've designed a solution that addresses exactly those blind spots with the phased rollout you requested. Here's a summary. Does this match what you're looking for, and are you comfortable moving forward?" That's a close, it's calm, it's specific. It references their words, and it gives them the agency to say yes on their own terms. That's how demand-led deals close, not with a bang, but with a confirmation. Now, let me step back and talk about why these 7 stages matter beyond any single deal. Because the real insight of demand-led selling isn't about technique, it's about identity. Most people who struggle with selling struggle because they've internalized a toxic definition of what selling is. They think selling means convincing someone to buy something they don't need. And because they believe that, they feel inauthentic every time they try. Their body language is off, their voice lacks conviction, their follow-up is hesitant, and prospects sense all of it because mirror neurons don't just detect words. They detect congruence. When your words say, "I'm confident," but your body says, "I feel like a fraud," the prospect's brain resolves that contradiction by trusting the body, not the words. Demand-led selling solves this at the root. When your entire process is structured around understanding what someone actually needs and then serving that need honestly, there is nothing inauthentic about it. You are not persuading. You are solving. You are not closing. You are confirming. And that shift from persuasion to service changes everything about how you show up. This connects to something deeper. The concept of specific knowledge that Naval talks about isn't just about what you know technically. It's about the unique lens through which you see problems. Every person who has spent years in a particular field has a pattern recognition engine that nobody else has. That engine is your real product. The service you sell is just the vehicle. When you approach selling as sharing your specific knowledge, when you lead with insight rather than pitch, you stop feeling like a salesperson and start functioning as an advisor. And advisors close at a fundamentally different rate than salespeople because the relationship is built on different neurological foundations. Trust versus pressure, collaboration versus transaction. The creative dimension is worth addressing too. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's research on creativity and flow established that creative output is not a function of inspiration, it's a function of system. You need a domain, a field, and a person working at the edge of their skill. Selling is a creative act. Every client conversation is a unique problem-solving exercise. The 7 stages give you the domain structure. The market gives you the field, and your preparation and practice put you at the edge. When all 3 align, you enter what feels like flow, conversations become fluid, responses become instinctive, and solutions emerge organically. But that flow doesn't come from talent, it comes from structure, and that's exactly what this framework provides. Let me address a common misconception that will come up. Some people hear demand-led and think it means being passive, just listening, never asserting, never challenging. That's wrong. Demand-led doesn't mean demand following. You are not a waiter taking orders. You are a doctor conducting an examination. And a good doctor doesn't just ask, "Where does it hurt?" A good doctor asks probing questions, challenges the patient's self-diagnosis when it's wrong, and prescribes what's actually needed, even if it's not what the patient expected. In fact, research on sales performance consistently shows that the highest performing sellers are those who respectfully challenge the prospect's assumptions. They bring insights the prospect hasn't considered. They reframe problems in ways that open new possibilities. This is what the challenger sale model calls teaching. And teaching is deeply demand-led, because you can only teach effectively if you first understand what the student's current understanding is and where the gaps are. So demand-led selling is not passive, it's disciplined. It follows a structure not because the structure is sacred, but because the structure keeps you honest. It prevents you from skipping steps. It prevents you from projecting your assumptions onto the prospect. It prevents you from talking when you should be listening, and from listening when you should be challenging. Let me also connect this to the broader philosophy of how wealth is created. There's a principle that I come back to often. If you want to live a prosperous life, you should be helping others create prosperity. This is not idealism. This is mechanism. Wealth, in the long run, flows to people who create more value than they capture. If you sell something that genuinely improves someone's business, reduces their costs, increases their revenue, eliminates their risk, you have created value. And a portion of that value will come back to you, not just as revenue, but as referrals, as reputation, as the compounding trust that opens doors you didn't even know existed. The Talmud frames this as a covenant principle. Commerce is not exploitation, it's exchange. And the best exchange is one where both parties walk away better off than they were before. The 7 stages of demand-led selling are designed to ensure that happens. You discover the real need. You qualify whether you can genuinely serve it. You present a solution that fits. You handle concerns honestly. And you close in a way that both parties feel good about. That's not just a sales process. That's a relationship process. And relationships are the compound interest of business. Now here is what I want you to do this week, not someday, this week. First, take your current pipeline and categorize every prospect. Ask yourself honestly, does this prospect have a real, urgent need that I can solve? If the answer is no or maybe, move them to a nurture list and stop spending active time on them. Focus your energy on the prospects where the demand is real. Second, before your next sales conversation, write down 3 specific questions that go beyond the surface. Not what are your goals, but what's the most expensive problem you're dealing with right now that nobody on your team knows how to fix. Questions that force depth. Third, after your next presentation, review it against the mirror test. Did you start with their situation, or did you start with your company's capabilities? If you started with yourself, rewrite it. Flip the order. Start with them. Fourth, find one concern that a prospect raised recently and ask yourself, did I address the real concern, or did I just rebut the surface objection? If it's the latter, go back. Ask the deeper question. You might save a deal, or you might learn something more valuable than any deal. And fifth, this is the hardest one. Identify one prospect in your pipeline that you should walk away from. Someone who doesn't fit. Someone who will drain more than they'll pay. Qualify them out, free up the space. Because in complex sales, the deals you don't pursue are often more important than the ones you do. One last thing. Everything I've described today is a skill. And like any skill, it follows the principles of deliberate practice. You need clear goals for each stage. You need to operate at the edge of your current ability, which means the conversations should feel slightly uncomfortable. You need feedback from a mentor, from a recording, from the prospect's responses. And you need to refine based on that feedback, not just repeat what's comfortable. Selling is not a talent you're born with, it's a discipline you build. And the people who build it systematically, stage by stage, conversation by conversation, are the ones who end up not just closing deals, but creating careers, relationships, and reputations that compound over decades. The people who succeed in complex sales are not the ones who push the hardest. They are the ones who understand the deepest. Structure doesn't limit creativity, it channels it. And a consultative selling process isn't a cage. It's a scaffold, build on it, and there's no ceiling. If this made you think, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs it, and follow along, there's more coming. Pin this question in the comments. What's the stage you tend to skip or rush through the most, and what has it cost you?